I have already recorded this entire video once. My phone battery died because I record all of these on my phone. I'm now noticing that the phone is wonky. Give me a second. But yeah, this is my my second attempt at recording this. After the phone died, I spent 2 hours trying to save the corrupted footage. So I spent 5 hours on a video no one will ever get to see. Yay. Now, before we actually get into the video that I've already recorded once, I'm going to forewarn you there's a lot of Gallic words coming up. I will mispronounce 90% of these, and this is just an advanced apology for every single time that happens. Also, I know a lot of people are going to say I'm straight up copying Wendigoon and the Law Lodge by talking about this sort of stuff, but tough titty. It interests me, and it's my channel, so I'm going to talk about it. Now, growing up, history wasn't my only obsession. I would spend hours watching documentaries on space, extraterrestrials, mythology, and folklore. However, one day I stumbled upon a show that would forever shape the years of my youth. Monster Quest, and the subject of cryptozoology. I became absolutely obsessed with the stories of the Jersey Devil, the Beast of Bodmin Moor, and the Chupacabra. But none captivated me more than the stories of the Orang Pendak of Indonesia, the Sasquatch and Florida skunk ape of North America, the Almas of Mongolia, and the Yeti of the Himalayan mountains. Yet there are no stories from Europe, no human-like apes walking around the British Isles. Yet there are British and Irish Bigfoot hunters, so what captivated these groups? Well, to start, we're taking a trip to the land of Mel Gibson in a kilt, to the mountainous regions of Scotland in search of the Liath Mòr, the big grey man of Ben Macdui. Now, one day, this will be the bit where I talk about our boy, Raid Shadow Legends, but for now, it's just where I tell you that you can get access to these videos 48 hours early for just £1 a month on Patreon. If you don't fancy that, you can get my book on Amazon, and if you want me with you at all times, you can get my merch. Links to all of those in the bio, but if you don't fancy any of them, it's alright, because the best way to support me is to like, subscribe, and share my videos, not forgetting to hit that bell icon so that YouTube knows to notify you when I upload. Now, without further ado, it's probably time I got on with the video, if I'm honest. The Cairngorms Mountains, or Am Mad Rud, those words in Gaelic, form a part of the larger Grampian mountain range. Being roughly translated as the Red Mountains, the Cairngorms get their name from the rosy red-tinted granite that would have dominated the mountain tops towards the end of the last ice age as the vast glaciers retreated. Now the granite has been rounded by erosion from frost and snow, whilst various species of mosses and lichens cling to life on the rocks, because for some reason they decided to live on a Scottish mountain. The Grampian Mountains, or Am Mad, again, those words in Gaelic, form one of the 3 major mountain ranges in Scotland. The Grampian Mountains occupy half of the land area in Scotland, including the Cairngorms, and 2 of the highest mountains in the United Kingdom. Ben Nevis, with a peak of 1,345 metres in Fort William, and Ben Macdui, with a peak of 1,309 metres in the Cairngorms National Park. The Cairngorms is part of an international family of national parks and is the largest in the UK at 4,528 kilometres squared, or 1,748 miles squared. For those of you who know why I've made a point of mentioning it's a national park, you'll get it. For those of you who don't, hold on tight. You'll know soon enough. The Cairngorm mountain range itself stretches for 1,207 kilometres squared, which is roughly 427 miles squared. Now, even though this creature is known as the Big Grey Man of Ben Macdui, the Liath Mòr is actually seen all over the Cairngorms, and according to some beliefs, whatever the Big Grey Man is, has been on Ben Macdui since ancient times. The Big Grey Man is described as 10 feet tall with long gangly arms like that of a gorilla in a 1950s movie. Those who get close enough to look describe an ape-like face with grey or brown fur. However, there are some claims that the Big Grey Man of Ben Macdui wears a long coat and a top hat. It's at this point it's probably best to mention that these are just stories and in no way proof that there is something living in the Cairngorms or on Ben Macdui. So take these stories with a pinch of salt. Or go look for a Big Grey Man wearing a top hat on Ben Macdui. I'm not your boss. Our first well-known and well-documented encounter with the Big Grey Man comes from the highly respected scientist and mountaineer Professor J. Norman Collie in 1891. In 1896, he would be made Professor of Organic Chemistry in the University College London. Collie was a Fellow of the Royal Society and also responsible for the first ever medical X-ray photograph. When it comes to mountaineering, Collie was part of the first attempt on Nanga Parbat, which is a 800-metre peak in Himalayas. Collie would also make 21 first ascents in the Canadian Rockies, eventually having Mount Collie in Canada and Skjor Formade, or Norman's Peak, in Skye, named after him. So this was a well-educated and well-accomplished man, and also a very experienced mountaineer who knew what he was doing and didn't scare easily. That was until 34 years after his visit to Ben Macdui, when he spoke about his experience at the Cairngorm Club in 1925. I was returning from the cairn on the summit in a mist when I began to think I heard something else than merely the noise of my own footsteps. For every few steps I took, I heard a crunch, and then another crunch, as if someone was walking behind me, but taking steps 3 or 4 times the length of my own. I said to myself, this is all nonsense. I listened and heard it again, but could see nothing in the mist. As I walked on, the eerie crunch sounded behind me. I was seized with terror and took to my heels, staggering blindly among the boulders for 4 or 5 miles, nearly down to Roffey Mercus Forest. Whatever you make of it, I do not know, but there is something very queer at the top of Ben Macdui, and I will not go back there again by myself, I know. After telling his story, Collie would be contacted by a Dr. Kellis, speaking of an encounter he and his brother had whilst on the mountain. They had almost reached the summit of Ben Macdui when they decided to stop for a break. They soon saw a huge bipedal creature walking towards them. As it got closer, they understandably turned tail and charged down the mountain, also vowing never to return. In 1904, biologist Hugh Walsh found himself on the mountain collecting samples with his brother. He would go on to claim that their time on the mountain was accompanied by enormous footsteps just outside their field of vision. This itself was accompanied by an unshakable sense of dread hanging over them. In the book Always a Little Further by adventurer and author Alistair Borthwick, he would claim that 2 climbers whom he was friends with had had experiences of their own. Allegedly, the first friend was travelling up the mountain alone. Once he had finished sightseeing, he turned around and began his descent back down the mountain. However, very quickly he noticed heavy footsteps behind him, one for every 3 of his. Looking back, all he could see was the moon breaking through the mist. As panicking on top of the second largest mountain in the UK isn't a sensible idea, he reasoned with himself that it was probably an echo, but if it was an echo, why did it have a pattern of every 3 steps? It was almost as if something large and bipedal was matching his speed, but not his stride. From this point on, he kept his eyes forward for fear what he might see right behind him. The footsteps carried on until about 1,000 feet above the Larrig. Understandably, however, he remained on edge the rest of his trip back down the mountain. The other friend was also alone, but instead of a misty night, he was accompanied by broad daylight in the middle of summer. This was, however, quickly accompanied by a thick fog. He also heard the footsteps, but instead they were following him up the mountain. They were also, he guessed, only a few yards behind him. Eventually, once the fog had cleared, he would see no signs of life. The suspicious thing here is he reported a heavy footstep for every 2.5 of his. It's also worth mentioning that he was 6 foot and the first guy was 5'7", meaning that whatever was following him was keeping the same pace as it did with the first guy. Borthwick was later out of a search party on Ben Macdui and decided to ask some of the gamekeepers and stalkers what they thought of the Liath Mòr. They simply replied, "We do not talk about that." In other words, the people that work on the national park didn't want to talk about the spooky stuff happening in their national park. Now, where have I heard that one before? Did I mention that the Cairngorms are part of an international family of national parks? For those of you still confused, there's a conspiracy theory in America that they're hiding something in the American national parks. And this is just me sort of applying that. If you want to get more info on it, just check out some of the Law Lodge's videos, because I'm not going to go into it too much and steal their entire vibe, just a little bit. In 1940, Scottish author R. MacDonald Robertson was camping with a friend on the mountain for some reason. Suddenly their dog began growling and barking into the darkness. They managed to calm it down, but then heard thudding footsteps passing their campsite. Each footstep would cause the dog to resume its aggressive barking, and it only calmed down fully once the footsteps had passed. Surprisingly, this didn't make them immediately pack their shit and leave. Or no, it is headcanon for me that the big grey man was just coming to pet the doggo, and then got scared by the doggo. Around 1941, author Wendy Wood would explain how a dull day around the cliffs of Cran Aglaeth Coin and Sron na Larig, yeah, those places, she decided not to push on any further as there was a boulder blocking her path, and as she turned around, she heard a loud, booming voice yelling at her in Gaelic. Wood assumed this was someone calling for help and began looking for the lost traveller. She could find no one in the near vicinity, and fear kicked in. She would run back down the mountainous track as fast as she physically could, all the while hearing loud footsteps following her most of the way. She wouldn't stop running until she heard a dog and knew she was safe. In 1943, Alexander Chunian, an experienced mountaineer and well-known naturalist, would claim to have come face to face with the big grey man of Ben Macdui. In October 1943, I spent a 10-day leave climbing alone in the Cairngorms. One afternoon, just as I reached the summit cairn of Ben Macdui, mist swirled around the Larg Grew and enveloped the mountain. The atmosphere became dark and oppressive. A fierce bitter wind whisked amongst the boulders, and an odd sound echoed throughout the mist. A loud footstep, it seemed. Then another, and another. A strange shape loomed up, receded, came charging at me. Without hesitation, I whipped out the revolver and fired 3 times at the figure. When it still came on, I turned and headed down the path, reaching Glenderry in a time that I had never bettered. You may ask if it was the Liath Mòr. Frankly, I think it was. In 1945, Peter Densham claims to have heard a crunching noise whilst being overcome with a feeling of apprehension. In 1948, Richard Frere claimed to have felt a presence, utter abstract and intensely real. He also claimed at one point to have heard an intensely high singing note. Not gonna lie, hearing the big grey man having a karaoke session must have been weird, but it wasn't all that happened to Frere while he was on the mountain. Allegedly, he was camping at the summit because, at this point, why not, when he woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. He claimed he saw something large and brown outside his tent and, understandably, was paralysed with fear. He would stay completely still, trying to quieten and hold his breath, waiting for the creature to leave. When it did, he poked his head out of his tent, because human curiosity always wins over our survival instinct. However, what he would see astounded him. He claimed to see a large creature walking away. Allegedly, the beast stood about 20 feet tall with a tapering waist, walking in a similar fashion to a human. In the 1950s, a woman named Catherine Allen would be camping on the beach of a lake near the famous shelter stones with 3 other people. For some unknown reason, they were sleeping outside. And believe me, I do not understand any of the logic behind this. The last time I went camping was in Dartmoor, and to the best of my knowledge, there was no suspicious Bigfoot-like creature roaming around. And once it got dark, I did not leave my tent. Hell, I didn't leave my sleeping bag. Now, allegedly, Alan was sitting on the beach looking out across the lake with her brother-in-law. At some point, they heard loud footsteps crossing the shingle. They were able to follow these footsteps as they walked past them. However, this does also give a helpful little story as, "Oh, sis, was you up late last night with my husband?" Yeah, I was. Did you hear the big footsteps? Walked right past us. Amazed. You didn't? That is the important story here. That is what we should focus on. In the 1990s, a group of 3 young men claimed they saw a dark humanoid figure run across a trail about 20 yards in front of them. Accompanying this peculiar encounter, they said they felt a sudden sense of dread. Upon reaching the point the figure had crossed, they heard a noise which caused them all to turn, and in the tree line, they saw a face. Understandably, at this point, they bolted. Whilst driving along a road late at night, the creature they had previously seen allegedly came up alongside them. The weirdest part of this story is the fact that, whatever it was, it managed to keep up pace with the car that was travelling at roughly 45 miles per hour for a short time before simply giving up. The author and mountaineer Æthelflæd Gray would write a book on the Big Grey Man of Ben Macdui, and the following is an excerpt from that book. "When I reached Cairngorms, I was soaked through, and as the weather showed no inclination to improve, I decided to stay. That night, as I dozed in front of the fire, the inner door was closed, but the outer one was wide open. Suddenly, I heard it close. Curious, I went to investigate and found the door tightly barred. The only means of getting out was by squeezing through the small hinged window. I said to myself, 'Akfui,' having come to the simple conclusion that a sudden gust of wind had slammed the door. But I still cannot explain today my action in re-entering the bothy by the window. The only possible explanation I can give is that it was prompted by some unrecognised, primitive fear." Finally, for our last story, in 2004, Scottish ghost hunter Tom Robertson was camping in the area with a friend. Allegedly, whilst they were trying to sleep, a 10-foot tall figure came up next to their tent and collapsed it with a single hand. Suddenly, Robertson and his friend found themselves staring up at a big grey gorilla standing over them in the moonlight. They immediately fled the area. However, even though this is our last story, people to this day still claim to hear loud footsteps following them when traversing Ben Macdui. This is another encounter from the late 1700s that I didn't mention because it's not specifically a sighting of the Big Grey Man, but it will help us move on and understand the first of the possible explanations. According to the poet James Hogg, he was tending to his sheep one day when he noticed something that terrified them. It was a giant blackamoor, at least 30 feet high and equally proportioned and very near me. I was actually struck powerless with astonishment and terror. Allegedly, it came back the next day, but when he removed his hat, he noticed the figure did the same. Hogg then came to the reasonable conclusion that what he was seeing was actually his own shadow projected onto the fog. This phenomenon is known as the Brocken spectre and can be seen at various parts around the globe once the altitude gets high enough above sea level. The Brocken spectre is often used to discount the few sightings of the Liath Mòr. Now, the Brocken spectre may seem like a good, plausible scientific answer to these sightings, but it's often seen with a halo or a rainbow around it, and I don't remember any of those stories discussing how they saw a rainbow gorilla. The next thing to look at, or rather listen to, is the big thudding footsteps that is the most common encounter people have with the big grey man. In fact, the footsteps are the most common, and there are many theories trying to debunk them, perhaps the most credible being how acoustics work on the mountain. Other than the mountain's acoustics, in other words, an echo, auditory hallucinations have also been put forward, which would make more sense for voices in the fog or angelic singing along the mountains. However, this could actually still be explained by the echo of fellow hikers and climbers. The only thing that really does struggle with the echo is the fact that there was a loud footstep for every 2.5 or 3 footsteps of those who reported hearing it. Others have suggested a more supernatural explanation. They point to ley lines, which is a concept I had drummed into me as a child and deserves an entire video of their own. But for now, to keep it simple, they're essentially a connection to the spirit world. For those of you that already know a bit more about ley lines, I know that's an incredibly simplified answer, but you really want to stare at this face for another 20 minutes while I try to explain them. To the one of you that said yes, thank you, I needed that. Now, the last explanation is the one that I've not so subtly been leading you towards this entire video. Perhaps the Æthelflæd Mòr is Scotland's answer to the Sasquatch, or perhaps more accurately, the Yeti. As I've briefly mentioned a couple times in the video, there have been cases of voices speaking Gaelic or an ancient archaic language. Some people have even claimed to hear unfamiliar music whistling in the wind. In all of these cases, they never seem to find the source, and if you go to the Isle of Wight, you'll find the Stone Age ghost of Mottistone. The reason I bring this supernatural encounter up is because some of the encounters are to do with people hearing strange chants in ancient archaic languages and unfamiliar music. So perhaps there is something supernatural going on Ben Macdui. Perhaps it is the Æthelflæd Mòr, or perhaps it's something separate. Don't forget that unexplained feeling of dread that many who traverse the mountain find themselves suffering from. As of 2010, scientists had only classified about 1.7 million species, and that's an estimated quarter of all the Earth's fauna. Yeah, I said fauna instead of animals. I used a science word. However, jokes aside, that means there's around 5 million animals we're yet to discover. Yes, I admit, most of those species are probably bugs, but there is a chance that one of those species we're yet to discover is the big grey man of Ben Macdui. But Scotland isn't the only country within the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. In fact, tales of wild men actually do spread across the British Isles. In the legends of Celtic and Anglo-Saxon folklore, roaming the forests and woodlands of these two islands is perhaps a hominid who is the best possible fit for a British and Irish Bigfoot. So the next time we take a dive into the world of mythology and folklore, we take a look at the woodwoes. See you in the next one. I'm currently midway through editing this video. I've got my first patrons, and you've probably seen them in the descriptions of the previous videos, because I can edit that quick and I can a video that's already been uploaded, and my upload speeds are awful, so it would take far too long to re-edit each time I go on a new patron. So yeah, this is the special mentions bit, because the top tier is the special mentions bit, so I'd like to say thank you to Alien as the special mention. There you go, my first Patreon special mention. There's the bookshelf, there's a T-Rex. Yeah. Thank you to all my patrons, though. It's just I had to... That it quite literally says you get a special mention. And, yeah, it's a month late. But that's the good news. When you eventually get bored of my existence, you still get a mention a month after you finish subscribing. Because you know, I'm uploading a month in advance. I'm going to just... Why are you still here?